Welcome to the Animation Happy Hour,
A podcast where we talk about breaking into the animation industry over a couple of drinks.
All opinions and views expressed in this podcast are solely our own and are not representative of the companies for whom we work. My name is Ben. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Katie, and we are all character animators working in feature film. So today we are drinking a near clipping plane,
Ooh.
which is a drink that makes you ignore everything that comes before it. And it is made with a very special whiskey, correct?
Yeah.
Called
Uncle Nearest.
18
yes. Something. 1886.
There's specific year.
Specific year that I don't know.
And we can't take credit for this name. This name comes from one of our very special guests who cleverly thought of it.
And that's some fun, like Maya extra levels to that joke there. So if you're in the know, I imagine chuckling to yourself like you never have before.
Yeah. And this special guest also came up with another drink, which we're not drinking, but maybe we'll have to try another time, called the Cameraman Hatton.
That's such a good name. I love it.
And I love Manhattan. So, yeah, someday.
It's perfect. Yeah, so we are super excited for today's episode because we are continuing our pipeline series with a day in the life of a layout artist. So today we'll be talking all about layout, what this job involves, how important it is to the animation process, what skills you need to get hired, what a layout artist day-to-day is, and much more. So we wanted to quickly give a listener shout out to Ben Santiago, who emailed and requested that we cover this topic. So we're super excited to be able to answer that call today. And honestly, layout is such a super important part of making an animated film, and I feel like it's not as well understood as some of the other parts of the process. So we're really excited to take a deep dive with some of the best in the industry. Hey, and with that, I will cut through all this anticipation and say we have with us the perfectly matched names, probably the most beautifully complimentary names we've had so far. Mr. Rocco Floramonte and Dorian Bustamante. Welcome. So thank you both so much for being here. So before you give your official intros, I'll just say both Rocco and Dorian currently work in the layout department at Walt Disney Animation Studios. Rocco is the layout lead and camera polisher. More on that later. And Dorian was a layout supervisor, most recently on Encanto. So we thought it would be helpful to have both of them on the podcast to provide their unique perspectives on the job. So with that, we would love to begin with a brief introduction and help our listeners get to know each of you a bit better. So we can start with the basic questions here. How did you guys get into layout for animation, and what sorts of projects have you worked on so far? Maybe we can start with Rocco.
I had a vague schooling initially. I wanted to be a photographer all through high school, so I took a camera with me everywhere I went. And my second college was for photography. My first college, I mostly just took dance classes. My second college was for photography. And I took photos for a while and then sort of burnt out on taking photos for other people or other people's ideas of what photos should be. And I realized it was just something I enjoyed doing for myself, but not as part of a formal education or even a job.
Sure.
And then I had the opportunity to go to Cal Arts and study in the animation program. So I decided I should do that. And when you sort of take photography and animation and put them together, you kind of end up with layout.
Yeah.
Because it is definitely a bit of both.
Yeah, makes sense.
Totally.
And as far as my career getting here, I was lucky enough to graduate from Cal Arts when people who know how to use computers were in high demand. I think if I walked up to Disney with the skill I had when I left school now, they would laugh and say, come back in 12 years after you learn to do something. But at the time, anybody who could use a computer in a graphic way was a valuable person to have. DreamWorks had just formed and they were hiring up everybody, and Disney was hiring up everybody they could because CG was just coming up to the front.
What year was that, by the way?
I graduated in 98. So Disney was hiring for Dinosaur.
Oh, yeah.
Is that the first CG that they did?
Pretty much,
okay,
yeah. Wow. It was a mix of CG dinosaurs over live action plates. So they don't call it a real CG animated film, but it kind of was.
Got it.
Gotcha. Wow.
That's crazy.
At
That's
least I
super
don't think they call it a real CG.
really cool.
So what was the job that you walked into for your first job at Disney then?
It was a workbook.
Oh, okay.
So workbook is it's a term we still use today in our CG layout process. At the time, though, on Dinosaur, because it was CG dinosaurs over live action plates, workbook was the process where we sort of blocked in the storyboards using CG characters, but we did it on real landscapes that a survey team had surveyed on location, so that we could send our camera data back to Hawaii or wherever they were filming these background plates, and they would know where to set their cameras and how to move them to get the background plates that then the animators would animate CG dinosaurs on top of. So it was a really roundabout process.
Jeez.
Wow. That is amazing.
Yeah.
Wow.
And a bit of history.
Yeah,
That's right.
Cool.
Wow.
So
Oh, well, yeah, I guess I could go next. Hey, I'm Dorian. As far as the background and stuff that I got into, I say when I was a kid, I saw Jurassic Park. And I think like a lot of kids, I drew a lot and I wanted to be a, 2D animator, do Bugs Bunny or, Disney stuff or something. So I was like obsessed with animation as a kid, but I saw Jurassic Park and then it was over. Like that was like, because I'd never seen flesh and blood creatures like go through. So it was more of just being astonished by how it was made, because my brain was going crazy. And I was like I think 12 at the time. So my parents had to take me. So I saw that movie like maybe 4 or 5 times. And I was really interested in CG animation. And I was probably, I was 12, I think. And then I was like, okay, I got to figure out what's going on. And then, I'm from Arizona, so there's nothing, right? It's just a desert with some suburbs. And, I didn't know about Cinefex or Starlog or any of this stuff that's going on. I'd go to the libraries. They would just look at me like, what are you doing? And, they would show me art books, but there's no industry books and all that stuff. And we didn't have a Borders or Starbucks, or, that was way before all that stuff. So then like Toy Story came out. I think it was 95. And I saw like animation using CG, and then my mind was blown again. So I was like, I got to figure this out. So I basically would spend time kind of researching it as much as I could on my own and trying to find opportunities and stuff like that. And there was nothing. You had a phone book and you had a phone, and, you'd go to bookstores. That's about all you had. And no one in my family is an artist, by the way. So I think my mom always says, like, I think my aunt took a watercoloring class in college. I think it's about as close as we got. My dad's an electrician. My mom's, she's a teacher, so everyone's kind of got, bankers and insurance, just normal jobs. So I was trying to figure that stuff out. And then finally in high school, when we were researching colleges, I was talking to different universities, and CG was starting to get taught in some of the schools. So I went to some of the art schools, and they had some of the like the university had one SGI machine for computer animation for the entire school. Oh my
gosh.
So like there was a list the guy was telling me you had to sign up for and stuff like that. I was like, okay, that's going to be hard. And then I went to another school, and they're like, oh, well, we're better. We have 5 students per machine, I was like, okay, all right, cool. And then I finally found a school that actually had 1 computer per student. Ooh. And I was like, okay, so I guess I'm going here. And I kind of lucked out because they were teaching Lightwave, and then they just got Maya. So as I was learning, and so basically I graduated in 99 in May, and by July I was already starting. And I happened right before I graduated, I happened to catch a talk of Prince of Egypt from a couple artists. And one of them actually I did work with later at DreamWorks, Sam Mitchell, really cool guy. And I saw that, and that was the first time I ever actually met an industry person. And I talked to him and saw his artwork, and I was like, oh, okay, this is starting to make a little bit more sense. So when I started the school, they were graphic design. They just started an animation program. So they were probably literally within this second year of doing it. And so I started right away, and I just started, just learning and learning. And, like a lot of schools, it was we're talking, late 90s, so it was very early on. So, they were basically just taking the Maya book and teaching it, and you would just do the tutorials. So then I was like, well, what if I just do all the tutorials and then just use the lab time? And, because it was like a 4-day-a-week class. And then Friday and Saturday were lab. So I was like, why not just use that time to do my own stuff, and that's where I started kind of learning more. And, I started meeting a lot of people who had similar interests and stuff like that. And then, so I did a short, and there was a friend of mine he was a student and became an instructor. And he was like, he knew a lot, like he was really, really smart guy. And there's some students there who were just like really smart, and they ended up kind of working for the school as instructors. And to kind of help pay my way, I also started working as a teacher's assistant while I went to school. And I was hanging around so often, students would ask me questions. So then we're like, why don't you just be a teacher's assistant,
Oh, wow.
So, which was really good because that kind of got me, to know people around the school and stuff like that. So when I worked on my short, and by that point, like we teamed up and we're like, hey, let's do a short and see what happens and stuff like that. And it was a friend of mine, Nathan. And one of the instructors saw it, and he goes, oh, one of the kids here, he went to Lucasfilm actually, like a couple years ago, like a year before. And he goes, we should send it to him and see if they're hiring at ILM. So I was like, great. So we worked on this short and we sent it off. And then he's like, no, they're not hiring here, but I think they're hiring at Skywalker Ranch. And so it got like redirected there. Wow. And then I got a phone call. And then they were like, hey, would you like to come up and, talk to us and stuff like that. So I just finished, like, I think I just graduated like a few months earlier, but I was still kind of hanging around the school. And then that happened. So I went up to the ranch, and that's where I found out about, there's an art department here. And they were just finishing episode 2, Attack of the Clones, and they were editing it. And so they were like, we're taking these deleted scenes and we're putting them on DVD, but we're still, editing right now and figuring out what goes and what stays. So I was hired as assistant animator to kind of help finish those off. And there's a small crew there. And that just kind of snowballed because they were like, we're also doing Star Wars, the third one. And then, but before that, George wants to do a special edition THX. And so it was great because I was 20, right, when I was there. And by the way, it's a wacky thing. So in the research, in high school, thank God, ILM released a book called Into the Digital Realm. So I got that on my birthday in high school, and I read through it, and it goes through the entire day work process. They talked about working, 4 days without going home. And, they talked about how hard it was. So I was already prepared that this is going to take over your life once you get into it. And people, they work all night, and they do models and they do this and that. So I read that book, and I loved it. I thought it was a great book. And then I read another book that was about Tim Burton and about his life. And then I think I must have read it wrong because he said at 18 he was at Disney. So I was in my head, I was like, I'm behind.
Oh my gosh.
I'm 20 years old and I'm like, I'm missing the boat, So
my gosh.
That's such a common thing, I feel like, for people to compare, to other people. You're like, oh, they'd had this when they were like a year younger. So it's relatable.
Yeah. And that was one of the only books that I read where someone actually talked about being a child and kind of learning the processing. But I got to find that book, but I swear he said he was 18 when he started. So my brain was like, well, I'm too old now, So wow. I got to the ranch and then we just started working. And by the second week, I knew this is tough, it's long hours, and I was young. I couldn't, we're not old enough to drink yet, and all that stuff. So, but it was great just being surrounded by everybody. And, it was one of those things I was supposed to be there for, I think 4 or 5 months, and ended up being close to 4 years, basically.
Wow. Dang. That's great. Hearing this story of how you had only like 5 students to a computer back in the day, I just think back on my experience and I'm like, would I have ever gotten into animation if I had similar constraints? That seems so limiting, but it's cool that you managed to find a school that was at least 1 per person, but just, going through that is fascinating, I think. But
Yeah, it's a little bit like research and luck. You know.
Yeah.
yeah, totally.
That's a good, I mean, sorry, we can get into the rest of the episode too. We're already getting too chatty, but that I love that you just said that, because we talk about that all the time too, where you definitely need both. And we always say like, whether your career is just taking off immediately or whether you're really struggling, do what you can, but if you're doing great, mix a little humility in there too, because you're probably just benefiting from some very lucky timing. And on the reverse side, if things are really tough for you, don't beat yourself up too much too, because it could be the opposite. You just kind of things aren't working out. So I love that you said that.
So then what, or when did you transition over to Disney, or were there any steps between? And
Man, okay, so
The storied history of Dorian's career.
yeah, and again, this is like my path is like insane. So okay, first job working for George Lucas, right? Started working with George, and then all of a sudden, Spielberg was working on a project. And something happened. I got put on hold, and George went off to go film in Australia. And so we were kind of left at the ranch by ourselves. But he still had a lot of sequences that needed to get done. So Spielberg was like, well, I'm bored and have nothing to do. So he came in, and a small crew went to his house, and they were working with him. And then we were working with them on the phone through fax machines. He would fax us stuff.
Oh, wow.
And so we kind of got this relationship, and Spielberg never did Previz before. So he didn't know about it. So that was his first kind of introduction. So before Star Wars ended, he's like, listen, the War of the Worlds just got greenlit. I need a small crew to come over to Los Angeles to work on it. And he goes, I want to grab a crew. So there was like 3 of us. So we all went down. It was a soup that, actually 4 of us, I'm sorry. The soup, his leads, and then myself. And so we all went down to Universal here. And we kind of started working on War of the Worlds. And we were like on loan from Lucasfilm. So that was the first time. So when we worked with him, it wasn't like, oh, we'll see you tomorrow, and then we go to our office. Like, so he moved his desk in our little area. And so like, he was literally next to me, and we would share a phone and, all that stuff. So, I was lucky enough to work with him one-on-one for, 4 or 5 months, every day. And he let me borrow his iPod at night. He had tons of his soundtracks on his iPod, and they had all this music. And I was like, oh my God, it's Hook. And then and he's like, you can borrow it if you want, just bring it in the morning. And I was like, great,
That's amazing.
But, just wide-eyed 23-year-old kid, just like, oh, this is the way it is, I guess.
Yeah.
And then so that's what kind of brought me to LA. And he was like, I remember one morning I came in and he's like, he was working away, and he's like, oh, I'm thinking about, there's this project I'm working on, and it's like, it's these toys called Transformers, and I want to do a movie about it and stuff. And he goes, would you guys be interested in maybe working on it? And I was like, the toy? And I was like, yeah, I remember buying those as a kid and stuff. And he's like, yeah. And so we kind of stayed a little bit to kind of help work on that, and kind of before Michael Bay signed on, because he was still finishing other films. So we kind of did some small pre-production on it. And then Michael Bay was hired, and we all got let go. But that kind of justified, moving down here to Los Angeles. Right. And then from there, I kind of stayed here and just kind of kept working on movies. And at the time, there was 2 companies that were formed, Halon, which was my supervisor at the ranch, Dan, and he started this company, and then Third Floor started with Chris. Mm-hmm. So all ex-Skywalker Ranch people, they started their companies. And so I was working with Halon when it was starting up. And then after a while, I kind of went to Third Floor, and then they were starting up, so both people that I, really, like and, appreciate. And I've slept on both their couches, Chris and Dan's at some point, we all kind of grew up. So, so I went to Third Floor, and they just started working on a lot of projects and stuff like that. And then after a while, there was opening at DreamWorks. So a buddy of mine it was like, oh, you should come over here and, try DreamWorks. And I was like, ooh, animation. That's right. But at the time, I remember I was at the ranch and someone mentioned DreamWorks and they're like, oh, they won't even look at you unless you got like 7 years experience. And I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll apply in 7 years, So when I applied, I think I just had 6 years. Like that's how my brain was. I was like, oh, they're not going to take me, and, but then, they did. So I went to DreamWorks and worked on Monsters vs. Aliens and stuff. And then, a lot of the DreamWorks people, and I would jump back from live action, because they had 3-year contracts. And once they were over, it's like, oh, Spielberg's working on another movie. So then go work over there and then work on some more films and then jump back when DreamWorks had something, so it's more of just what interesting projects. And at a certain point, like a lot of the DreamWorks people went to Disney, because it's a small industry. Yeah. So then I was, at the time, I was working on Endgame. So I was helping Soup on Endgame and Infinity War. And I was across the street at Marvel. And I ran into Nathan, who's our DP on Encanto, Nathan Warner. And we're chatting. And then he's like, oh, interested on maybe coming over? And I was like, yeah, of course, And then that's where we started communicating and talking. And then I applied to Disney, and then they were cool enough to go, okay, I guess he's okay, and then I was able to kind of literally just go across the street and work over there. But it's a wacky path. And then I was on Avatar for a bit and worked with JJ for a bit, so it's like wow, it's weird, and you just walk. It's not something that you consciously go, one day I'm going to work for James Cameron. It's just like you get a phone call and it's networking, and it just you work long enough, people like you, and you get a phone call and, people, oh, I know this guy, I worked with him on War of the Worlds. He should come over to Avatar, stuff like that. So it kind of just goes around.
Is it common for layout artists to kind of, and we'll probably get into this once we get into the questions, but is it common for layout artists to go between animation and live action, and switch so often, or is that unusual?
I think now more than it was before. And animation, it's the thing with layout and animation lets you plan your life because the films take longer to make. It's all at one place. If you're lucky, like DreamWorks and Disney, they, from the script to the final 3D color correction is all done in house, which is great. But in live action, it's always a fire. So, but they have deadlines. There's a different situation. You might need to, oh, you know what? We're doing this in London. We're doing this in Vancouver, and then next thing you know, I'm 5 months in Vancouver,
Gotcha.
So it does, you jump around a lot more, and it's a little more kind of, I guess, stressful just because time is money, and when you're on a set, there's 100 people or 50 people. It's very expensive, so they want to get things done and answers solved quickly. But in animation, it's a little bit of a slower pace. So some people just go, I don't want to deal with live action once they get into animation. And it's very understandable that once they go, they don't want to go back. But if you're like me and you're just like, well, I'm just looking for something interesting, then the transition isn't really too different if you're able to adjust.
That's super cool.
Wow.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's super, super valuable for our listeners to hear is, just that journey and path around. And I do want to backtrack and revisit your background as well, Rocco, and see after Dinosaur, have you been at Disney since then, or have you moved around a bit? And
I moved around a lot, and I think it was similar times. But Dinosaur was not my first job out of school. It was actually my second. So I started off doing match moving for Babe, Pig in the City. And for those who don't know what match moving is, that's basically looking at live action film plates and trying to align a virtual camera up with where the real camera was. Hopefully you've got data telling you where to put it. And then in the case of a talking animal film, matching a CG model of a pig to the live action image of the pig so that the textures can be mapped onto the model and animators can animate it. So that was my first job out of the gate. And that came about mostly because a lot of my graduating class went to Rhythm and Hughes. And this probably will come up when we talk about the value of going to school, but most of the jobs I got started off with somebody that I went to school with. So,
Yeah.
Gotcha.
or built off of the previous job, as you were sort of saying.
Sure.
Yeah, so that was the first job. Then Dinosaur, and after Dinosaur, I was let go. I usually say fired, but that's probably mean to say because they just let me go. And I wandered around. I did another talking animal film or two. I worked at Rhythm and Hughes and Sony. I did a Previz film with Chris. And when we say Chris, that's Chris Edwards, one of the founders of the Third Floor. Because he and I had worked on Dinosaur together.
Oh, okay. Good.
That's where he and I met. Treasure Planet at Disney.
Love that movie.
Wildlife. I just watched it last night for the second time ever.
Oh gosh, really?
Yeah. I was talking with Roy, the producer of it, the other day, and we're talking about, well, how long it has been since Treasure Planet. And he said, it's a pretty good film. And I said, really? Because I don't remember that. But I watched it last night, and
Did you have a better?
I had a much better experience second time around.
You needed some time.
Yeah, I just had to get further away from it.
Yeah.
So Treasure Planet was a project I was on just for a few months because my time at Disney for that period was split between that and Wildlife,
Okay.
which was a film that didn't make it to the theaters. And I was let go, and I came back to Disney to do what would be considered a creative legacy project, but it was Mickey's PhilharMagic,
Oh, yeah.
the ride at Walt Disney World. We did the IMAX projections for that.
Yeah.
Nice.
And then I was let go again. And my fourth time back at Disney was for Meet the Robinsons.
Mm.
And after that, I managed to get the stick. So they have not fired me lately.
Nice.
But in the middle of that was visual effects, previs, talking animal films, both in animation and in match moving. In fact, I think on Stuart Little 2, I was working at Sony doing talking cats. And I think they just had more people than they had work. So they let me go. And I'm pretty certain I left Sony and went over to Rhythm and Hughes and worked on the same movie.
Oh my gosh.
Doing the same thing. I'm not sure. I have that feeling. My memory is very, very poor as to what my actual work career was, though, for better or for worse.
It's cool that you talked about, getting let go and stuff, because I feel like that is something we talk about, that it's a very regular part of the industry. It's not like a weird thing that, especially in our creative field, it's just when a job ends, you get let go, then you find a new job. I mean, I don't know. We talk about that, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. I think we do.
It's an important thing to say, especially, there've been artists at Disney who've come and gone a couple of times. And I think once you get to Disney, if you are the sort of person that enjoys the atmosphere that Disney provides for you, you just don't want to go. And you've found all these wonderful people who are so creative to surround you. And every moment you're there, you're just sucking knowledge off of these people and getting better at your craft and making hopefully great content and enjoying your job. And when you have to go, it can really, it's like having your dream snatched away.
Yeah.
But my dream was snatched away 3 times, and I came back to it.
Yeah.
That's so valuable to hear, because it's so easy to, it is a little unique to animation for sure, or at least the entertainment industry. And it's so easy to take it ultra personally and be like, okay, well then I'm never working there again, and F that place. And, you just certainly understand those feelings, but you just, tell yourself it's not just you, we have, right here sitting with us 2 people who have basically risen to the top of this craft, and they've dealt with it. So don't worry. It is very much the norm. And don't be too hard on yourself.
Yeah, I think one of the things that always helped me was I always felt like the kid who snuck into the house, not supposed to be there. So, and I was never, if it did, I was always prepared mentally, for it to end. Every, to this day, in the back of my head's like, they're going to find out. And I'm like, I just came up with that for, just and they're going to kick, like that's always in the back of my head. So
age-old imposter syndrome.
yeah. And when I was at Lucasfilm, I'd hear a lot of the stuff from ILM because at that time, when CG took over, a lot of the optical people got let go. So they went from CG or optics to CG. And I heard the stories of, from people at ILM who've been there for a long time, were just like, they didn't, they said opticals aren't going away, that they refused to touch computers. So now they're not here. So
What is optical? Sorry.
optical, it's back of the old traditional techniques for special effects. So optical printing and, models and all that, stuff like that.
Gotcha.
So, and I think they created the optical, I saw the machine there, but it was back when, it wasn't a computer, ghost lens flare and Ghostbusters, it was, a hand-drawn cell that was kind of in, and it was, they made, what do they call it? When they'd have blue screen, it was like a chemical to take away the matte, the blue matte, not this. So it's all before computers.
Got it.
And they're always kind of telling me, like, just always just adapt with what you have, and be prepared. Always be prepared. And one of the storyboard guys, he's now at Pixar, but he gave me some really good advice, and he was like, treat every week like your last week, and always do your best. And when you get the axe, you're not going to be depressed about it or anything. And he goes, it's you did your best, and if every week you think it's your last week, then mentally you're always be prepared in case something happens. So don't get too comfortable, and don't worry, things always pick up,
It's great. It's a tip jar right there.
Yes.
We don't even need to ask you guys for the tip jar.
Right? Yeah. Thank you both so much for joining us today and sharing all of that awesome information about your backgrounds. So moving forward for everybody listening, in this episode, we're going to have Rocco and Dorian walk us through what a typical day at work entails for each of them. And then we will ask them a series of questions that were submitted by our lovely listeners. Thank you, listeners. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll get a much better understanding of what being a layout artist is like. So to begin, we will start with the super, super basic question. Explain like I'm 5. What is a layout artist? And I think it would also be super valuable to, if there is a distinction between kind of the live action previs world and layout within animation, to also describe the differences there, if you don't mind.
Sure. So I'll start with talking about what a layout artist is, and probably starting with what is layout.
Yeah.
But just to be fair, most of my layout experience comes at Disney Animation, so other studios may differ. But at Disney, layout is it's many things. It's the first digital 3-dimensional representation of the film. So prior to layout, the film is in storyboards. It's cut together by editorial, but it's just storyboards. When it gets to layout, we start assembling the 3D assets and putting them in sets and throwing cameras on them. And once we do that, it becomes the blocking pass and staging pass, which plans out sort of the rough movement of the sequence, where the characters will be, what they'll be doing to a certain extent, where it will take place, the composition of that photographic frame, and what lenses will be, all the cinematographical properties related to the camera.
Right.
Not so much the lighting, but the camera portion.
Gotcha.
And it's also kind of setting the stage, as you all know, for the animators to animate upon. When I describe my job or the layout process to people who don't necessarily understand animation, I talk about it in terms of a live action film, which I think people can imagine, where there's an actor on stage or on set, and there's a camera, and the actor acts and the camera points. It's been planned out in advance, but we sort of do that backwards in animation. We have to figure out where the actors are going to be when they eventually show up. Which is you guys. When you show up, we got to figure out where you are going to be. And layout is the part where we do that. I feel like this is a horrible answer. I might want to start all over again.
Oh, really?
No.
You can if you want. But for what it's worth,
I'm going to ask Dorian.
Right.
Dorian, where should I have stopped? Where did I go off the rails?
No, I think it's good. It's a tough nut to crack, because it is kind of pre-planning and figuring out the blueprint so that, down the road, the pipeline will actually have somewhere to start. Because it is blocking cameras and it is blocking characters and stuff like that to help the animators figure out stuff. But also, too, it's also giving information to environments, art direction. They can do paint overs now. So it's the first visual stab, at 3D with real assets, real characters, real cameras and all that stuff. And that does help because, when you have storyboards, a lot of times they're doing storyboards. They don't even have sets. They don't even, they might have a character design. They might have one piece of concept art, but, the scene that we're doing takes place in an area that they didn't do concept art for, or they're still working on it. So we're kind of in there also taking a stab at the 3D space to give information to everyone else as far as like, you're making a cave. Awesome. But we're only going to be focusing on this little part of the cave, so you don't need to model the rest of it, just focus on this section.
Yeah.
And so that they automatically know, they're shooting here, here, and here. So let's help them and provide that information in those areas and high res those details as well. And then, the other thing is like the rhythm of it. There's when it gets an editorial, I always call it the video game version of the movie because it's also, not pretty. It's very grayscale, maybe some lights or something, but it's a rough representation of the flow of how the shots are going to do. Because like each shot, when it's cut together, we have this thing, and you've mentioned it a lot of times where it might not flow right from shot to shot. So it's not just the staging of the characters, but it's also the flow of how each shot is going to go into the next shot and the next shot.
Sure,
and the next shot.
yeah.
So it's also the sequence of, should that feel, how do we make it feel exciting? How do we make it feel sad? And that determines composition, camera shake, lenses, and stuff like that. So it's, taking the first stab at nailing a lot of questions early on to feed the pipeline down the road when they make it really nice,
Yeah, it'll be helpful too. I think in our show notes, we'll definitely have like maybe like a reel or something where it literally shows like, okay, this is storyboards, this is layout, this is
that'd be cool.
Like, lighting, animation, just, we'll probably put that in there just to be like, just to see it. But I think you guys personally did a great job explaining it.
It's funny talking about it with Dorian's assist. There are a lot of things that are in layout that layout does that are not what you think of as the cinematography of the film. And we do think of ourselves as cinematographers, I hope. I certainly do to a certain extent, minus, of course, the lights, because that is the elephant in the room of layout, is that we don't do the lighting part of cinematography. But there is just so much else to talk about that is informing editorial of the timing of an actual 3D world.
Yeah.
A character can walk across a room in 2 boards if you have storyboards. But it takes a lot longer when that character actually has to move at sublight speed.
Sublight speed.
So we are informing editorial or helping editorial find the timing of a shot, and obviously it changes in animation sometimes, but it gets us one step closer. It's that layering of more information. The world is real. It's not just a hand-drawn image of what the world might be. It is a 3D volume. The sets, though they may be scout sets that we're just using to flesh things out, they are informing the modeling department, as you say, Dorian. There is a lot to it that isn't summed up by the word cinematographer. And yet I feel like that is the core of us as a department, as we're a department of cinematographers that just also happen to be generalists often in many aspects and provide a lot of information to lots of other departments to help them take the film to the next step.
Yeah.
That's great.
Actually, that's a good transition into live action.
Hey.
Previz as well.
Hey,
'cause
go for it.
it's very similar. So early on when Previz was getting started in the industry and stuff like that, live action Previz is basically the same thing. If we're lucky, if we have storyboards, great. But sometimes they don't. And it's not because the storyboard artist doesn't want to do them or they don't have a storyboard artist. It's just because he's working on a sequence and he literally doesn't have time to do it. Or, if we're lucky enough to get storyboards, then we can kind of do the same process of animation of go into layout, go into Previz, which is basically figuring it out, putting in the correct lenses, putting all that good stuff. And that helps live action figure stuff out, because now, we measured the sets that they're going to be shooting on. So we have that information. Sometimes I know, like at Marvel, they do LiDAR scans of everything. So wherever the stages and the sets are built, we can take those and drop it into the CG environment that's going to be expanded. So we have at least some of the data of, the big thing in live action is we're limited to physical sets. So when you're doing camera moves and stuff like that, that has to be set up and created. So if the camera can't go in between, two consoles on Star Trek when they're all in the bridge, then the camera can't go there. So you have to be kind of aware of making things a little more realistic, because a guy actually physically has to do it. And one of the interesting things, when I first came to LA and I was on War of the Worlds, I remember doing Previz for a sequence, and then like a month later I was in a room and it was like, the head of every department of ILM and the producers and and they were just breaking down the Previz, because now they were like, okay, there's a boat here. Okay, which location are we shooting at? Okay. And then they were automatically getting bids. So ILM was like, that's going to be too expensive to do. We could do that. And they were shot by shot, just going through and getting a bidding process of how much it would cost, where they could shoot it, and so it's kind of helping them plan, stuff out. So that's kind of on the live action end of it for Previz, and that's before they start shooting. So that gives them some information. So then there's a process after they start shooting, which is post-viz. And post-viz is kind of like final layout, which Corey will explain shortly. But post-viz is basically like, okay, we've shot the elements, and there's a green screen there, and they're standing on dirt. Cool. But that's supposed to be a planet back there. And, we have a character that is kind of represented with the tennis ball here. That's supposed to be the Hulk, or something. So now the editor needs help cutting it together, because he's just having a person standing in the middle of a green screen with a tennis ball. So then post-viz comes in and goes, okay, well, we'll put in the Hulk. Okay. And we'll put in the planet back there. And, they start tracking the shots, replacing the green screen, and actually taking the rough edit and actually replacing it with the elements, so that the editor has something to cut with. That's not, that wasn't there before. So, and then the same process happens afterwards, where now the vendors who have to do the final shots once the shots are approved and the directors love it, they send it to whoever's going to do the final shots now. So now they have something to go, oh, okay. So that's where the guy's going to be standing. And okay, so the Hulk's CG is going to be in 4 of these shots, not 10. So that's going to cost this much money. So now they start doing the final breakdown of the costs of the final effects now. And that helps them. And at least they have a temp edit, so they can see where the CG character enters and where he exits. And they have a blueprint for that as well, but with the final plates and the final cameras and stuff like that.
Got it.
Wow.
And for like people who don't understand, Previz stands for pre-visualization, and post-viz stands for post-visualization? Okay.
Yeah, and Previz, it's wacky because they spell it with an S or a Z, depending on, and I'm not sure where that started from, but it's stuck around for the longest time.
Nice.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I've never heard of post-viz, and I feel like I've been like in a cave somewhere, because it totally makes sense that would be part of the process.
Yeah, and post-viz, it was kind of new. I know, like on War of the Worlds, we started doing a little bit of it, and after I went to DreamWorks and came back, it just, every time I come back to live action, things just, Previz kind of just kept getting bigger.
Yeah.
Because in the end, it does save them money when you got a team of 10 people doing stuff without any of the actors, and, building the world for you and figuring out all the angles and all that stuff like that. And, post-viz really exploded, because once they found out, oh, this actually helps plan out the budget and the visual effects, and they'll do complete sequences and then end up cutting them out because they don't work for the story. Well, good thing it didn't go to final,
Yeah.
So all that was figured out in the post-viz stage, so just like,
super interesting.
And then, one thing we forgot to mention in Previz or layout, we do a lot of passes of this. So the storyboard does they do a lot of boards before we get it. And then, so once we get it, then we'll do our pass. And sometimes, we get it done in a couple passes, and other times it might take 5 to 10 passes of doing it to make sure we got the right shot angle or that it's got the right feel and stuff like that. So it's not, you have to be aware that whatever you're working on might get thrown away or redone, and you can't hold it too close to you, because that's kind of the job of what we're there for, basically.
Wow.
That's absolutely true. And the way we make movies, it's not as though the entire story is written and then the entire film's boarded and then it's all edited together and then it's given to us to start. They figure out an outline. They board some sequences. They edit them together. They might not have act 3 yet, but we got to get started. They'll give us a sequence and we'll start working on it. But because the story is so in flux, even if you do that sequence perfectly and everybody loves it, the story may be changing again.
Right.
And the closer you are to the front of the pipeline, layout being pretty close to the front, the more likely you are going to have to accept that things are changing underneath you, and the concepts that you've sorted out for your sequence may not really matter anymore, or may be totally different.
No, for sure. And I know in animation, they have board artists, and luckily the director's there, so everyone's kind of, sometimes you'll be doing layout and all of a sudden you start getting new boards, for the end section because they figured it out.
Exciting.
But they're able to go in and kind of like help, buffer that change in there on the spot, which compared to live action doesn't really happen all the time. So, live action, I say my experience has been 50-50. So sometimes you have boards, sometimes you don't. And, sometimes it's just brainstorming stuff in 3D and shots. And when there is a big change like that, then you're kind of just stuck there and having to figure it out with the director,
So our next question is, we would like to know, this is the heart of our Day in the Life series. So tell us, what does your average day look like? And, feel free to include, does this vary depending on the project or position, VFX versus animation, et cetera? I'm sure it does, but I think we're starting with Dorian.
So the average day, so I'll just go from scratch. So, you just got at your station and we get a kickoff. So we'll get a sequence. It's all boards. And, this is Disney animation, by the way. And so we'll get a kickoff. They'll show the reel of the sequence and boards. The director will give his feedback on notes and what he's thinking and stuff like that. And then, anyone who's assigned to that section, we'll all be kind of sitting in the room and asking our questions as far as like, oh, what'd you mean by that part there? And so getting all these details to help us work. And so once it's handed over and we're all satisfied with no questions and we're good to go, then you kind of break out the sequence to different artists. So you take the first half, I'll take the middle, someone else take the beginning or the end. And then from there, you kind of look at your section. And in some cases, the sequences are so small, a whole person can take it because it's very simple. It's a dialogue scene or, and it also depends, I have to say, how complex the sequence is. Because if it's a big actiony sequence, those take a little longer. So you might want more people to work on it. And so once you have your section, then you kind of sit there and you look at it and you've got the boards and now you're translating the boards into 3D. And kind of like Corey was saying earlier, sometimes you have characters that are drawn that are actually very different. There's one time I was on Kung Fu Panda, like Po is huge and his dad is a duck. It's really fun. But they would always draw the boards with them talking to each other like this, so they were side by side, as if they were the same height, and
how do I do this?
So you're like, okay, all right. So that's where the problem solving comes in and you're like, okay, all right, well, they're different heights. Is there a box I can take to have them stand on a box or, and start doing that. And sometimes we'll tackle those questions on the turnover because immediately, we've been doing it for a while. We can tell right away like, oh, that might be different. So is it okay if we do this? Maybe we go a little wider to do this and stuff like that. And so we start kind of blocking out the shots. And then in that process, you also kind of start finding the flow of the shots, how they cut together, eye lines, all that good stuff.
Yeah.
And that's where the film kind of emphasis comes in, because you understand like the 180 rule as far as like how not to cut so it's uncomfortable to the eye. Because I think there's this subconscious thing when you watch enough films, even, if you don't know anything about movies, you still kind of understand the language of film because we all grew up on it. And that's one thing we're always trying to be conscious of as we work, is to not make things look uncomfortable. And I know like we've been in situations where, we're looking at a sequence and then, someone just says, I don't know, something just doesn't feel right, and that's such a hard thing to explain because it's a subconscious thing that you're trying to put into words of everything you did was correct in film language, but it doesn't work. It's sticking out and it's, and it's causing an issue. And a lot of times you'll find out it might be because the lens you used before was the same lens. So you did two 50 millimeter lenses back to back, or the shot that comes after is actually the same composition as the shot that you put before. So that stands out. So there's a lot of little things like that happen. And that's part of the process of going through the shots and, over and over and showing it and making sure it's all flowing nicely. And that's kind of, the bulk of it for composition and cameras, what we're kind of focusing on. And then there's the rhythm of the shot. How fast is the shot? Is it a quick shot? Is it a slow shot? Like Corey was saying earlier, they drew 2 frames of him exiting the room, but it's going to take a lot longer than that, and how can we do that, but at the same time, keep the same rhythm that the boards had of the energy of the shot, but then giving it a real world, physics to it. And how much can we cheat actually that, once the animators get it, they're so good in 2 frames, they can get it, but figuring that out too. Yeah.
There's a backside to that situation as well, which is probably there are 2 boards there because they didn't want to spend any time on that character getting out of the room.
Oh, yeah.
So, when you're in layout, you could either walk that character across the room for 3 or 4 or 10 seconds, whatever it takes, or you could possibly think of a way to be someplace else for a moment and then come back and find that character at the door of the room or leaving the room or something to save the time that obviously they didn't want to spend up front. And, it's finding those cheats, as you were saying.
Yeah. And that's the film language part of it where, if someone's walking through a room and they're opening a door and they're exiting, like, I say, look at, and again, one of the biggest things in the world is, really study the real movies. If you look at Born Supremacy or the Born Identity, any of those movies, there's some really clever editing and stuff, but your brain catches it where instead of him opening a door and walking through and then exiting the front, you could follow him, but that's like a video game, right? It's very kind of boring and seem, but he could just look at a door, cut to him grabbing the door, turning it, and then cut to him just outside exiting. And your brain automatically goes, oh, okay, he exited. But it was done in 3 shots and it was literally maybe just a fraction of a second of a door. So there's little cheats like that to help. But so once we kind of get that on board and figure it out, then we show it to the director, and it's the first rough pass. And then the director looks at it, and then he gives his input. And that's where he can go, this is feeling a little too slow, or that shot doesn't look right, or he had something different in his mind. Maybe we should shoot it from another angle. And that's where we start getting the notes after the first pass. And sometimes they're very small, where we stuck with the boards and they were great and he really likes it. And, there wasn't anything big that came up. But other times it was like, okay, they boarded this chase, but once we got the real sets, we had to change a few things, and maybe he is happy with it, maybe he's not. So then we start getting notes. And some cases, like on Raya and the Last Dragon, they had a fight with the daughter and the dad over this pond. And when we showed it, I was like, okay, well, here you go. And he was like, it's feeling too short, actually. It's like Raya needs to maybe fight back a little. And, we need an extra beat of her actually getting one up on her dad, and it's not in there. So then I was like, okay, so then you go back and you go, okay, how will we do that? And me, I'm big action, kung fu guy, like action films, I just watched those like crazy. So I was like, oh, okay. So I cut together a little sequence with some old kung fu movies and stuff. Oh, cool. And then, found, because every angle has been done. Every angle you think, if you're able to kind of remember it or find a movie that has examples. So I cut it together and then showed, I think it was Carlos at the time. And then I put it right in the spot. And so she goes, and then you cut to this live action, like 4 or 5 different shots. And then I cut back to the animation. He goes, yeah, that works. Okay. So I just, okay, boom. So just figuring out stuff like that. But that's pretty common. That's basically stuff I would do in live action. Okay. They call it videomatic sometimes. But it's kind of, stuff that you have in your brain, but you got to show it.
It's like mood reference for that moment in particular.
Yeah, but you're also getting the camera angle and you're getting the staging. So there were some shots I knew from like Ip Man, I think Ip Man 2.
Oh yeah.
That they were fighting on these tables where it showed their feet a lot. And so I remembered that. So I went back to the films and I cut that because they were like going back and forth. And again, being like action movie, like I always have a weird Tebow in my head where whenever I work on something, like images go in like from different films. Like it just, I don't know how, but it just comes up. And I kind of can go, oh, okay, this is like, okay, that's like Beetlejuice there. And then this was like, It Man, like just all these different references just kind of flow in. But that's like problem solving that we do. And then once you show that and you get all the notes, then, if they're happy with it, then it just goes off into the animation world. And then you guys have something to kind of work with. And so that's kind of the typical problem solving. I might have gone a little too long.
No, I want to pop in there and talk about what you talked about with the Videomatic that you did. And I want to point out that that's sort of some Dorian magic. Dorian, with his extensive previs and live action background, and also just the number of years he's been doing this for, he has a lot of ways of working that maybe are not unique in the world, but they're different from what I'm used to. And he has a lot of shorthand. He has that head full of movies. He also has the movie collection to back it up, I believe. But most importantly is that he remembers them and he can draw from them. And putting together a Videomatic to show the director was such a great idea, because what he didn't mention is that we were having a morning meeting every day with Carlos trying to solve this sequence.
Okay.
And getting a director on schedule to show up every time to figure something out is not easy for us to do because they're very busy. But it didn't take us very many of those mornings before Dorian hammered this together and got these ideas figured out. And between the Videomatics that you do, and the CubeViz, which is another part of your process that I don't see a lot of people doing in layout. You have some novel ways of working that I think are really strong.
Yeah, and then that kind of goes. Every artist is different how they work, and again, I was going to school. I was never taught anything. It's just mostly it's learning on the job type of experience, and so. You're kind of in live action, you're forced to come up with stuff or start like, well, you got to do it in 2 days. You can't do it in a week. So, okay, well, how can I do it faster? And, there's a lot of people around you who are used to that and they're very experienced and they go, oh yeah, just do this and that. And, you'll be fine, and you're like, oh, that was handy, So going into the CubeViz, that was a technique, as I was saying, because artists do things differently. Some artists can sit there with the final, rigs that we have and plan it out and start doing shot by shot with the final assets. And it comes out great. I'm very impatient. So if I can't scrub in real time, like my brain goes crazy because I need to see or I'm just play blasting, trying to get the shot in real time as much as possible. And sometimes the rigs are too heavy. Sometimes the sets are too heavy. So I always try to turn off as much as I can to try to get that real-time motion. And for me, that helps with getting the shots together. So one of the techniques on Avengers, on Infinity War that we started having was the visualization supervisor, Gerardo. He came up with these statue characters, and we've had them before. We used to call them origami characters because they were literally like Minecraft, like cubes of the characters, but it represented the shape of them. And we used them, it's been a technique around for a while before we had final models and all that stuff. And it was basically lightweight. And he actually took those, and there was no rigs, and actually just used them as placements and to plan out the shots. So, instead of having the final character and taking all that time to do it, you could have a low res version with one click. You could set a key and get the timings of it and all that stuff like that. So that kind of stuck with me. And I went even lower than that and said, well, why don't I just take a cube, put it on the dimensions of the character. If they're big, I'll make it a bigger cube. It's small, I'll make it a small cube, and assign a different color to them.
Yeah. And
just use that for blocking out the animation. And that way, in a day, I could do at least 10, 15 shots, get the flow of it going. And I'm not dealing with a rig that I pull and then I wait a few seconds and then it moves, and stuff, because that stuff drives me mad. So that's my version of kind of, being able to block things out as fast as I can kind of process in my brain to help with that flow. It's like, if I was an artist, that would be, holding a pencil to a pad and doing a rough sketch and trying to get it in 2 seconds. So that's kind of a technique that I kind of picked up and kind of just did my own, little thing. But, luckily it's helped speed wise. And then I go back and I put the characters in because I basically previz the previz. I did layout for the layout. And then I have, my shots there, and I know that the timing's right and it's flowing right. And then I can start using the cubes. I put them on template layer, and then I can know where the staging is. And it's not perfect because, again, the eye lines are not going to be there. It's just a cube, and stuff like that. But at least I have a rough idea, and I just need to adjust it. And I know when things get slow, it's correct. I just need to, just focus on it. And that's kind of part of the process. And I've been luckily, when I came here, all the supervisors that we're working with, they're really cool with it. And that's stuff that I just did for myself. And then I would wait until I had the rigs, and then I would show the official version to people and directors and stuff. And some directors can see it as cubes and they're cool with it because they understand the rough process. But there's other directors, especially in live action, who aren't used to working with previs. They really need to see the real characters and all that stuff on there. Otherwise they start getting confused and they're like, why is there no textures? And
what is this cube?
Yeah. Why am I paying you for cubes? But it's part of the process.
Wow.
That's super cool. It's funny. Are you guys finding parallels with animation as you hear? I'm just like, oh my God.
I had a feeling you would.
Yeah, totally. I mean, with everything too, just sometimes just cutting in, movie clips and stuff for reference. Or it's all about just getting everybody on the same page mentally as quickly and efficiently as possible. Good Lord. It sounds so hard. I mean, not just blowing smoke for you guys, but oh my gosh, I think we talk about it all the time. I think, Garrett, you and I probably had a conversation about it a couple weeks ago where I think I do the most minor camera tweak because it was something stupid I did in animation probably. And I was like, I hate this. This is so hard. You can move it anywhere. You can do anything. And the lenses and everything, not to mention having to fill in gaps with storyboards that, things are cheated versus just making it up by yourself in the 3D environment. I mean, really, I think that's why it's so difficult. We have a long answer when you say, what's a layout artist? Yeah. Because you do it all. You're a storyboard artist. You're a, cinematographer. Editor. You're an animator. You're an editor. You're everything all in one. So, gosh.
You're also doing it. The one thing that I'm realizing as I listen to you too, that I didn't really, it occurred to me, is that you're looking at shots over the course of a sequence rather than just looking at one shot. Because that's obviously what we do, is just make the one shot work. And then obviously you look at the shot after and the shot before, but you're coming up with the whole flow of the sequence, which is also very challenging, I can imagine.
And that's part of the process too. Because, if we go back a little bit, when that sequence was broken out between different artists, then we all put our shots together. And so now it's going from, this artist to this artist to this artist. And, maybe when you put it together, maybe the bridge that connects them doesn't work. And so now they got to start talking to each other of like, oh, I have her standing over here. And it's like, well, my shot, she's standing over here. So there's that communication as well when we start working to make sure that like when they sit down, they're sitting on the correct spot, that the next person is going to start there.
Right.
Gotcha.
We've actually sort of had issues with that when working on our technology at the studio, because at a certain point, the shots don't exist. They are marked as shots in the cut. But until we actually do them in layout, they're not really there.
Right.
It's weird. It's a weird thing to say, but in working on our tools, we've had software folks say, well, how do you deal with the shot at this stage? Well, we don't have a shot yet. We have a sequence.
Right. Yeah.
So we're working on this broader thing. It may be split up between 3 people, but it's not shots until we make these things.
That makes sense.
And send them to editorial and have them reprocess them and spit them back out to us. And that's when they become, well, technically they're not even shots there until we publish them.
Okay. Gotcha.
Wow.
Yeah.
But at least they're a more realistic version of a shot. So it's weird. We do view the sequence as artists, but we also are sort of kept away from shots in the functionality of the pipeline for quite a while.
Huh.
Wow.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Dorian. Now we're actually going to ask the same question to Rocco, and because Rocco actually holds kind of a strange, that's the worst way to say it, a unique position at Disney right now. So I'll let Rocco talk about it.
Yeah, it is. It's strange. I think if I have a job description at the studio, I probably wrote it, and I honestly don't remember what it is. But my primary function is the camera polisher.
Okay.
And I think I can split my job up into 3 or 4 parts. But the camera polish job sort of came about around Tangled, I believe. And what we realized in layout is sort of what you were talking about with how you deal with your shot or maybe the shots around it. Mm-hmm. Or now animators are lucky to occasionally get 7 to 12 shots in a row.
Right.
If there's time and the shots are short enough and there's time.
Yeah. Big asterisk.
Yeah.
But often an animator has 1 shot or 2 shots, and those shots are part of a sequence. Mm-hmm. So what would occasionally happen is that the animators would just get so focused on their shot and getting the performance in and getting their character viewed in the best light and from the best angle or at the best distance that fit what they felt they were trying to do, that it sort of broke how the sequence worked. Mm-hmm. So the camera polish position was kind of created to have a layout artist embedded in the animation dailies process so that we could just point out if the shots had gone off the rails. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So it was a lot of watching and trying to remember what we had done in the first place.
Gotcha.
And seeing if it was different. And then it sort of became, from that, it became helping the animators with their cameras, because if an animator has changed their camera and we need to get it back into something that fits within the sequence, then it's often easier just to jump in and make that change and hand it back to the animator than it is to try and talk the animator through what the shot should be. So that added another layer to camera polishing, which sort of became camera fixing. Mm-hmm. And that also developed camera support, because often your characters are moving off frame or doing things that the animation requires them to do, the story requires them to do from an animation perspective, but we just didn't account for it in the camera when we did the layout, because we were guessing based on storyboards. And so someone has to repoint that camera at the character. Yeah. And again, if the camera polisher can do that for the animator, not only do I have a greater familiarity with the camera, perhaps, but it also allows the animator to keep working on other shots they may have. And that's a big part of my job, is making sure you folks never have to stop working. Sorry.
Yeah, it does it very well. You see the bags under our eyes.
Well, I know you have a lot to do, and our films are never on ideal schedule. And I think, while having an excuse to go get coffee might be nice, I like to leave that up to you and not force you to go get coffee when you'd rather be working because you've got to leave early to go pick up the kids or, live your life the way you want to live it. I want to make sure the animators can keep working as effectively as possible when they want to. So handling the camera and making sure it's working for them and at the same time working for the sequence overall is a primary function of my job. Mm-hmm. As a layout lead, that part of my job sort of starts when the sequences are still in layout. Mm-hmm. And that is, it also kind of started on Tangled because the head of layout on that show, Scott Beatty, and I get along very well. We have very similar ideas of how films should work. We're both, I would hope I don't offend Scott by throwing him in this bucket with me, but fairly conservative filmmakers. And certainly we understand the language of our princess fantasies, which the Tangled and Frozen sort of cinematography style that really sits well with us. And it has a certain sensibility to it that, I don't know. It works well. We work well in that environment, and we see eye to eye when we talk about those things. But working as a layout lead on Tangled with Scott, I would basically I would sit on his couch and complain. That's the best way to say it. I'm going to do a little sidebar here about how art is made. And this is my own philosophy. I feel like there are two types of art. There's additive art and there's subtractive art.
Oh.
Yeah. I would say Dorian is an additive artist. He just keeps building on what he's got. He starts with either J.J. Abrams talking him through a story and then builds upon that and keeps building upon that and keeps building upon that until it's beautiful. I work through criticism. I subtract things that suck or that bug me. So I need something there. And in the case of how layout has sort of worked out, sometimes I have to look at what's been done, whether it's come from our layout artists, and there's that thing we just can't figure out that bugs us. It's finding that thing sometimes, or if all the shots left layout seemingly perfectly and they come back from editorial feeling weird, it's making sure we smooth that sequence back down. Yeah. And it's almost like I've become kind of a minority report in that process where I'm not as deep into it as the artist is. So I don't understand necessarily why choices were made by the artists or how we ended up at certain places. But it allows me to walk in with fewer preconceptions, I suppose, and maybe call out, question things that maybe were done for a very good reason that may not exist in the sequence anymore. Yeah. Or maybe were done for a very good reason, but that isn't coming through. And it's just because everybody else knew it, that it was working for them. It's
see the bigger picture kind of a thing.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, it really is just me sitting on a couch saying, is that shot? Is that right? Is that
I just want to add real quick because Corey's there from the beginning to the end. And a lot of times when Corey's in the meetings and stuff, when we're showing sequences or getting feedback, Rocco has a good way of bringing people back to what was the purpose of this shot, or did we lose a story point, or are we telling the story well enough with what we have here? Do we need to embellish it? Do we need to add more shots? Or so he has a very good objective opinion on is the sequence is actually working, and
always the case, he's right. And something is missing.
Not always the case.
Well, all the cases I've been with you, it's always been like, that's right. I never really thought about that. Or you know what? We were, that was supposed to be the purpose of the story, but is that working anymore? Is that something that we did? And, maybe we need to make it stronger or something. And then that's kind of questions we bring up with the director as well, so it's a good kind of like, he's monitoring it, but he's also asking some very good questions that we should be thinking about, or sometimes we just start working and forget about it and just do what we're told. And then you start going through it and then you go, oh, you know what? Maybe this could use a little help or something. So it's it's an important role.
I think my biggest regret about the process is that I'm not necessarily quick about those kinds of thoughts. And more often than not, I have an epiphany about how a sequence should be after we've seen it 15 times and we're sitting in editorial with the directors. And I say, wait a minute.
This is all wrong.
Should we have done this instead? And all of a sudden, the sequence that was about to get approved is going back to layout.
Gotcha.
And it's all my fault.
There's something about seeing it on a different screen in a different room
Absolutely.
that just opens up new parts of your brain.
Absolutely. I try to justify it that it is the environment, the context. The other day, I realized sometimes it's just watching somebody else watch it.
Yeah.
And seeing when they go, and for the audience, I am pursing my eyebrows and looking thoughtful.
Yeah.
So they just get that expression on their face, and you think, okay, there's something here that is bugging them, and in the back of your mind, it starts running, and you're thinking, what is it that we missed? What is it we missed?
Oh my gosh!
And
So relatable.
But it is a weird job because I'm criticizing other people's wonderful artwork, and I am so grateful to the layout artists that tolerate me and the layout supervisors that tolerate me and the directors that tolerate me, introducing ideas that, they may not actually make the film better, but they definitely slow down the process. So that is a layout lead part of the job.
Yeah. Gosh. Well, I'm so glad just to hear you say that, 'cause it's something we've brought up many times. I just want to harp on it again. It is because I do think there's such a stigma for all artists, especially animators, layout artists, everybody, that if you get notes, if something comes up, oh, now you're a bad artist, or like you didn't. But that is such a natural, it sounds obvious to us now, but like I cannot stress enough how much like rock star layout artists and the best animators I've ever seen, sometimes they'll show a shot and it's just not right for X, Y, and Z. It just doesn't fit in with the whole, even though the thing by itself is beautiful. So I wanted to call special attention to that. I love how you said that, you're critiquing beautiful stuff, but it doesn't mean it's right per se. So.
And I think honestly, when things get, the more beautiful things get, the more we're allowed to look at the tiny, 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 tiny things.
Yeah.
And again, it's like we made this so beautiful, but did we tell the story, or did we just make it beautiful? And you got to wonder that and ask that question periodically. Also, to be fair, Dorian, I ask it sometimes because I don't know if the directors have changed the story since last I looked at it.
And that does happen. As we're working, sometimes it's like, don't work too fast. Things are changing. I'm like, okay,
makes sense.
Yeah,
all right.
It's so important for listeners to hear how much things change in the professional world, because in school, at least I was taught, you got to lock your script, do your storyboards, and then you just make your movie. You can't change anything, and it's like not at all how it works in the real world.
It'd be interesting if it did. I often wonder if we would make outstanding films that way, or if we wouldn't. I mean, we'll never know. That we will probably never know. Because I'm not assigned necessarily to a sequence, and I'm not, my schedule is sort of wherever the meetings fall, I will be doing something. I also can sort of set my own workload and take on projects that I want to, that I see, that I think are important. And sometimes as editorial is approaching a screening, the editors or assistant editors will just send me a mail and say, hey, we've got these images from Layout that were great, but animation's got rough animation, which we would love to have as well.
Oh, okay.
But all the temp effects and visual interest that the layout artist had in the sequence really tell this part of the story, and we want to have that with the latest animation.
Yeah. Can
you just merge them together and give us some pictures? And, I like to tell the editors yes, because having them, again, appreciate me is very handy when I give them or when I offer up differing opinions on how shots should be. Sure. I don't want to say give them notes because it sounds very dominant. When I offer up a difference of opinion to what they have, which I tend to do because I can't keep my mouth shut when something bothers me. So I'll work with editorial to just sort of do kind of little fixes to get things looking right for a screening, or if they trim a shot, or if they have two shots that just don't work together anymore because of cuts that were made, they might call me up and say, hey, can you just take a look at this transition? It's just not working. And I'll sort of kind of attack that transition, knowing from working with the animators for so long what causes your department pain, and try to avoid things that are going to hugely mess up your shot for you. And knowing from working through the layout department what the greater goal of the sequence is and how we got to that point in the first place. So it's kind of like a just a little special task squad of one. Yeah.
Is it just you doing that? Because that could be for a whole sequence. It seems like a lot of...
Other people may do it. I don't know. But I look for problems, and wherever I see them, I try and attack them if I have time. And because I have no set schedule to my day, other than be in the meetings where I need to find stuff out and keep animators working, and whatever else comes up, I just assign myself to the task that I deem most important. And I think it's a freedom of my role that maybe we shouldn't put in a podcast, because maybe nobody else knows that I have that.
But, that sounds pretty nice. Yeah. Your own schedule.
It allows me to tackle what I consider to be the most problematic things.
Yeah.
Or sometimes the lowest hanging fruit that will have the greatest impact.
Gotcha.
But it's really an on-the-fly judgment of where I could be useful. And sometimes it's sitting down with a piece of technology and saying, is this tool working well enough? Do we need to tweak it? Does it?
Okay. Yeah.
Or have the TDs fixed it? Is it working now? It's really kind of a handyman sort of job. Mm-hmm. And there's one more aspect of it, which is not a formal part of my job either. But as Dorian said, I stay on the movie pretty darn close to the end. Certainly through most of layout finaling, if not even longer sometimes. And just looking at images, sometimes it's protecting, again, the sequence as a whole and making sure it still works, because after layout and after animation, edits are still being made and changes are still being made. Sometimes it's protecting animation, a performance that I remember an animator talking about a point that they wanted to get into their shot and doing a certain thing, but it's in shadow or it's just not coming through the way it was intended.
Yes, Rocco's saving the animators. That's awesome.
It's just it's because I have this fortunate position of seeing the film so long along the way, from the storyboards when it's turned over to layout, through the layout process and all the edits that take place there, through animation, through layout finaling, and through Sweatbox, and then into lighting tech check or 2K check, whichever it is called. And not having any set schedule, I'm in a weird position to be aware of a lot of things that are either history or a history of a shot or an intention of the shot that just should still be there.
Yeah.
Sometimes it trips me up in that the thing I'm worried about is not a story point anymore, as Dorian also pointed out. I'm worrying about a thing that isn't a thing. And sometimes, sometimes I ask the directors if we need to, do we need to do this thing? Or is this moment better saved for later? And they'll say, no, we're not doing that thing. Don't you watch this movie?
Sure.
And I think it's, I don't know if it's a unique ability, but I have a trait where when I see things on the big screen in the theater, I can spot little things that just pop out sometimes.
Yeah.
Some of the lighting supervisors tease me about tangents.
Oh, yeah.
And how much I get distracted by bad tangents. There was a shot in Frozen 2 of Olaf spinning on the forest floor. It was a down shot, wide shot. Mm-hmm. The floor is a sea of red leaves. And we just watched it in DCI, which is where we approve the final frames of the image before they go off to post. So before they go off to final color timing. It's really our last hands on the film. Lighting's been done, everything's been done, final rendered images.
And that's in the theater.
And that's in the theater, so we can all see it big. Yeah. We play through the shots twice with no sound, so we're not distracted.
Oh my gosh. I just know my heart rate would be at like 240 like that whole time.
And there was this shot, it played through and everyone was happy. We'd gotten 5 shots through DCI or whatever, they were clapping, and there was something in it. I didn't want to spoil the mood of the shots and the celebration of having the shots done, but there's something in it. So I went back to my desk and I scrubbed through, and on one frame there was a spot about 3 pixels by 3 pixels
Oh my gosh.
in the middle of the sea of red leaves that popped red. Or just
weird.
Just a little red blip in the middle of the sea of red. And it was just that thing that caught me in that moment. So,
did you bring it up with the?
I sent the lighting soup and the VFX soup an email just so it could be at least known.
Yeah. Sure.
I know I make people angry when I point out things like that, and I also appreciate their patience. And sometimes I know when they say, "Yeah, we'll look at that," they're saying nobody's going to know. But color timing is a place where something like that on one frame could easily just be knocked down. So
totally.
Gotcha.
I hope that works out in situations like that. So that's probably the final 8th part of my job.
Wow.
That. So.
Wow.
We should have you watch all of our shots all the time.
Yeah. You already do pretty much.
Yeah, you do.
I guess I do. Yeah. So yeah, it's weird. And again, it's not something that anybody necessarily asked me to do, and they may not be happy that I do it, but I feel it makes me feel useful. And at least one of our visual effects supervisors says, I would rather know that the mistake is there and be able to choose not to address it than to not know it's there.
Gotcha.
So hopefully I help with that part.
I feel like it's a hugely important part to have someone be able to look at those things. And I can speak just from being with Rocco and Dailies, you do bring up things a lot about the camera or little things. And it really helps in the room to have just a quick discussion about it, and the director should be like, yeah, that's right. Okay, so layout, can they update that? Or animation, can you update it? So I don't know. I think it's super useful.
Well, I don't think it's necessarily something that's specific to me either. I think it's just, it's more the fact of the nature of my role and that I talk a lot and don't have to answer. I'm not responsible for anybody's quota, I guess is a way to say it. I never get blinded by the fact that something needs to move downstream. I probably should. But it's not necessarily a skill I've got. It's just the freedom of the role to ask these questions and look at things that aren't necessarily the most important thing to everybody else in the room.
Gotcha.
So it's a weird job. But to say what it is on a day-to-day, my day usually starts with coffee before I go to work, reading every Slack and every email from the day before.
My gosh.
Um,
I cannot imagine what your Slack looks like.
I've gotten good at skimming.
Yeah.
Again, with a weird job, there's a lot I can ignore. Knowing that other people are handling it. Oh, they've got that. Great. They've got that. That's not me. Nobody's answered that Slack. That might be something I should look at. It's so emails and Slacks early in the morning. And then when I get to work, it's looking at the schedule of meetings. If there's a workbook turnover, which is where the storyboards are turned over to layout, I'll go to that because it's I want to get the director's intent on the sequence. I want to hear them issue it to layout and to the other departments. If there's a layout editorial session where layout is working with editorial to sort of choose the shots and find the timing and work the cut of the layout shots together, I'll try and be there so I can see how things are fitting together and what the editor's intent is for a sequence, because that's something I should preserve if I can. The editors certainly can't make it to all the meetings I can.
Sure.
If there's a director review of layout, I'll try to get there so I can see what the directors liked about the layout, what they didn't like about the layout, again, what they're hoping for, and what they're hoping to get out of animation to build upon the layout. Because then when I sit with the animation team, I can carry that knowledge forward.
Sure.
And then if there are animation dailies, I'll certainly be in dailies where the directors are looking at the animators' work and hopefully approving it. But I'll be making sure the cameras are still working. And there's that small window at the beginning of dailies where we look at continuity for 2 shots before, 2 shots after, and maybe we see it twice. And that's the window where I have to figure out if the shot is still working.
That's so funny to think about.
And remember what that shot used to be, if it's changed. If you could look at my notepad, so many of my notes are shot number. Is this the right camera? Question mark, question mark. And then the artist, the animator's name, so I know who to check in with. And there's a lot of it that are probably sound mean when you look at them. Did he change the camera? What broke? Question mark, question mark.
That's so funny.
And it's just go back to your desk and look at this later and figure out why this isn't playing how you remember it.
Yeah.
So I'll ask and interject quickly. Do you appreciate it if an animator caveats and says, "Oh, by the way, I played around with the camera, but like, please let me know."
I do.
Good to know.
Again, for me, the more information, the better. And I've already told you many times on microphone and off how bad my memory is. But there are certain things that stick in my head, and sometimes shots are, and sometimes I remember them completely wrong. And that's why I ask myself, is this the right camera? Before I say, did you change the damn camera again? And there's a difference in the way we're working now on our films.
Yeah.
Rather than, say, 4 films ago, maybe, where the directors have pushed more shot approval onto the heads of animation. And the heads of animation are pushing more shot supervising onto the animation supervisors. And it means a lot more decisions are happening in animation rounds than in the past. They used to be all the big decisions happened in dailies and everybody knew about them. So that's forced me to try and go to rounds a lot more.
Wow. Yeah.
It sort of started around, I think Big Hero 6 was when I saw animation rounds was a place where I needed to be because a lot of decisions about camera were happening.
Yeah.
And things that affected the camera or the cut or the sequence were happening. So I might go to animation rounds as well. And then there are layout finaling meetings. There's layout finaling issuing, where layout finaling artists are being issued the shots after animation. where it's sometimes good for me to be there because I can talk about what the history of the shot during animation was. I can say, I know this looks wrong to you because it looked wrong to me too. But I asked the directors and they wanted to preserve this part of the shot, which you might not see as important looking at the shot on its own or even in context of the sequence, but it's a point that works out someplace else.
Yeah.
So there's just, it's passing on this oral history of how the film came to be.
Gotcha. Wow.
And sometimes they'll ask me, is this right? And I'll say, you know what? That is something that I remember from Layout that we put in there and definitely does not suit the animation that the performance we've gotten back. I'm sorry I missed that as I was going through animation. If you can fix that and make sure the animator's okay with it and it doesn't screw up their work, please do, because that is a good catch.
Gotcha.
Interesting. Huh.
So there's a lot of things like that. That's layout filing. And then as time allows, lighting tech checks. Sweatbox is a big part of our process where that's when we pass shots from layout filing to the back half of the pipeline, the back end, which is lighting, tech anim, although they've usually started by then, effects, although they've usually started by then. And, well, lighting's already started by then, too. Let's be honest. We've probably done 2 or 3 passes, but
Oh, my God.
Sweatbox is where we say we're not going to mess with anything related to the camera and the character animation.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
And supposedly the composition of the shot. Although, caveat.
Sure.
So I'm also in Sweatbox because that is kind of the only time you get to see the shots cut in to the sequences properly by editorial. And then you can see that greater continuity if you need to say, we have a shot similar to this one, 5 shots before. Are we double beating it? Did we screw something up? Is this cut still working? Do these sequences butt up together correctly? Or did we have sequencitis because we did sequence 21 in November of the previous year and sequence 22 in June of this year?
Oh, yeah.
Did the 2 work when we put them next to each other?
Yeah.
Things like that. So that's another meeting where I like to be because camera questions come up. And again, I might be the person who's free, who has the time just to do little tweaks and attacks on that cut and make sure that they're still working. So those are the things that I can do in a day-to-day. And somewhere in there, in 5-minute intervals here and there, I'm dropping by the animators' desks to make sure that the cameras are working for them if I saw something suspicious in dailies, or if I've gotten an email or a Slack that an animator has issues with a camera, or if an animator's performance is outside of the camera and we haven't seen it yet in dailies or rounds, it's great to get a preemptive heads up from the animator because then they don't waste time working on a camera that's useless to them, and we can get it on track faster.
Gotcha.
It's a lot of stuff like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very little time to actually tweak cameras, if with all the meetings.
Yeah.
Seems like.
I would say that as a layout artist, I'm very slow. When Dorian talked about the types of sequences that are full of action and split up between 3 or 4 artists that are intense and take a lot of work, and then the kinds that are just talking heads that could be done by one person. I'm the person that would love to take the talking head sequence because I'm slow. I can pose, but I can't move characters that well or quickly. There are so many artists that are great at that and much more imaginative than I am. I told you I was very traditional sort of Disney animation cinematographer, or animated princess film cinematographer was the shorthand I probably used. So I my strength is not making really cool shots. My strength is making structured shots and keeping the continuity of the sequence and tweaking cameras. I can tweak cameras pretty quickly. So in the 5 minutes in between meetings, or if I get a half-hour break, I can just churn through several. And I work really late. When our films are in crunch, I'll work a lot of hours. Disgraceful amounts of hours sometimes. But
gosh.
It's one thing working from home has really done that benefits me is that instead of writing a note that says, is this the right camera? And then going back to my desk whenever I have some free time and checking, I just check.
Yeah.
And it's great because I can know right away and I can start to figure out what went wrong while we're still in that same meeting. And sometimes I can even bring it up in that session.
Yeah.
Before we lose the directors who may want to weigh in on whatever I'm about to say. And when we have the animator and the supervisors and the heads of all right there. So that's been great. But a lot of times it's just making notes, running back to my desk, making notes, running back to my desk, just running around, getting my steps in, as one might say.
Gosh, that's I think. Sorry.
No, actually, just really quick. I think Rocco brought up some really important points that. Let me just explain kind of like the positions. Like we have. Yeah. So the positions in layout and what their responsibilities are really quick. So, in the layout department, you have your layout artists, which at DreamWorks is known as rough layout. And in live action, it's known as previs. So, but at Disney, it's just layout. And that's kind of the people who first take a stab at the sequence. And that's where we got the boards and we're figuring out all the stuff that we talked previously. And then also, you have your supervisor. So the supervisor, kind of like what I was doing on Encanto, it's basically you have a sequence, and then I'm also supervising different parts of the movie. So I'll be supervising sequence 7 or 212 or something. And then in Encanto, we had 2 supervisors, Joaquin and myself. So we would he would have 3 or 4 sequences. I would have 3 or 4 sequences. And then above us is the DP. Or the head of layout for the show. So he's kind of the guy that's overseeing everything from the very rough beginnings to the very final. So like he's there just like Rocco is throughout the whole sequence. And he's jumping in to also give feedback to when we're like, okay, the sequence is looking good. This is kind of what I was feeling we should go for. And he will take a look at it and go, oh, okay, that's good, but there's this new note here, or it's looking great. Let's show it. So he's in meetings. The DP is in meetings all day long. And if you saw their schedule, it's insane. I mean, it's literally from like 9 a.m. to like 6 or 7 or 8 straight meetings. I mean, it's just this colorful bar in Google that's just there. Yeah. And in between that, he'll do check-ins throughout the day for us as supervisors to help show him stuff and as artists as well, so we can get feedback. And because he's in so many meetings, he's able to kind of give us feedback on if things are changing, maybe a conversation they had in another meeting that we need to know about in this sequence. So, you have your artists and then you have your supervisors and then you have the head DP. So those are the kind of the 3 areas in the day-to-day, workflow that we have. And as supervisors, you're kind of in between. So it's 50% meetings and 50% work. So it's a nice, balance because you're working on your own sequence, but at the same time too, you're overlooking a couple other sequences as well, and you're kind of giving your feedback and helping them kind of mold a sequence together or give them notes or anything like that. As opposed to the DP, it's early on, he's able to help out when you're starting and no one's not really on the show yet. And it's a very slow start. You can work on sequences and stuff like that. But then as the full show wraps and everyone comes off of the other show and comes to your show, he's in meetings all day long and, doesn't have that chance to touch the computer for the rest of the project, so he relies on us and relies on the artist to, get the work done. So depending on the position, it could be a very different experience. And some people like that. Some people don't, when I was on Avengers, one of the, things that I kind of realized was like, when you're souping a team, you don't get to work on any shots. They have all the fun, so they're explaining stuff to them and they're doing stuff and you're editing it together and, working with the editor and sending stuff back and forth. You don't really get to do any of the shots. So at the end of the day, I always feel like I got nothing done today. Like there's nothing I did nothing creative. Like I got nothing done. So that's, some people like that and some people don't, so that's why luckily when Endgame came around, I was able to kind of step down and go to a lead and then just go, okay, all right, I was supervising for a little bit and, that sequence is over. Now I go to a lead and now I can actually work on shots. Finally, after like almost 3 years, I could start working on shots. And then I can kind of start working on that. And then that's where the creativity, and I was like, this is feeling really nice. I would hate to not work on any shots for a long period of time. And, now on this current film after Encanto, I'm back to just being an artist, so I'm just like, just my schedule, very few meetings, I get to work on shots all day and, the creativity, I get to turn that back on and actually do shot work. So it's been a lot of fun, but, I kind of like jumping around, and it's a weird thing because I've always like, well, once you stick to something, that's all you want to do. And some people go, oh, I'm a supervisor now. So I'm, that's going to be my title forever. Or, this or that. And they don't want to step down. But if you're comfortable, there's nothing wrong with it. You can jump around and it's perfectly fine. It's whatever that creative drive is and whatever you kind of feel like you want to contribute, to the craft, basically.
Yeah.
It's probably helpful
That's a great point.
Oh yeah, to like do like to kind of bounce between as like an artist and supervisor in some ways, because then you kind of know a little bit like what they would have to deal, like the artist would have to deal with. I don't know if that's true or
no. That's actually one of the cool things at Disney. The supervisors helps out on the next show, so they come in as a regular artist. And, they're in there doing shots, and working. Yeah. So they don't, it's not like that. They kind of, it's a good refresher, I think, for them as well of just, they go, oh, this is what the artists were dealing with, or these are some of the issues they were complaining about. And so they have a better understanding of how it is, but everybody does that. So it's a good refresher on, oh yeah, okay, this is what's going on before they, jump onto the next big film, and I think that's great. That helps you kind of not get too comfortable or to understand the process of what's going on now, because every film kind of there's different technologies, there's different pipeline stuff that change. So it's the show that was last as opposed to the current show may not be exactly the same because there's new tools that came out or they replaced a few things. So it's kind of helping them, I think, kind of keep up to date to that stuff as well.
Yeah.
Seems really useful.
Yeah, for sure.
Now that you've said that about the schedules, the calendars, it makes me think that there's actually no part of my job that couldn't be better done, perhaps, by the person in charge, be it the head of cinematography, head of layout, or a layout supervisor. It's just that nobody else has time. Again, if they could sit in dailies all the time like I can, they'd solve these things. If the layout artist could get a shot back from an animator, they could solve those things, but they're busy. They got real jobs. They, they can't sit around. So really, I just fill the gaps of people who are too busy.
I think this is a legitimate point, but perhaps said in the most humble way possible, right?
I don't think so. I work with talented people. You have observed that right in this room.
Well, that's certainly true. But yeah. Talented people everywhere. I gotta say, this makes me much more nervous whenever we talk to people to animate any shot, because I'm always like, oh my God, by the time it gets to us, so many much more talented and smarter people have worked on it. And I'm like, oh, I just don't want to F this up now. So it's just so valuable to hear. And certainly, people to come after us too. I mean, I'm saying nothing of worth other than it's just incredible, these things, how incredibly collaborative they are. And everybody is really bringing their A game, regardless of the department. So sorry, I'm just having a little fanboy moment about the industry in general.
Super humbling to hear. And so impressive.
Yeah, for sure. So we've mentioned this a couple times now, and I know you two aren't necessarily, don't want to speak for you, but perhaps not experts on this because it's not your particular part of the pipeline, but could you tell us a little more about Final Layout that's come up a couple times?
Sure. I'll talk about what we do at Disney, and I know Dorian probably has some experiences from DreamWorks that he might be able to relate. But a final layout, or layout finaling, or ELFing, as we call it at Disney, is the final step before we hand the shots off to the back-end departments, lighting, and tech animate effects. And what it's basically doing is making sure the camera's not going to change ever again, making sure all the assets are in the right place, dealing with a lot of continuity of assets. That's the final pass on the camera, although hopefully I've done my job well enough to do too much. But they do have to do a lot because I can't do everything. It's tuning up camera shake across a sequence if there are any outlying shots.
Oh, interesting.
And a lot more than that, just to make sure everything, not only the visual of the image, but the data moving from the front end of the pipeline to the back end of the pipeline is correct. So it is both artistic and hugely technical, and a very important job.
Wow. Yeah, and I think a good part of it too is, getting the final assets, and because when we get them in layout, sometimes there's a asset built, but it's not finished yet, just because that's the nature of the pipeline. So sometimes we're working with kind of temp assets that they give us, but they're not the final. Or sometimes it's a vehicle that's not rigged, and stuff like that. So once it gets to the animators, and it comes back to final layout, they kind of help make sure that, okay, that's the real set that's going to be rendered and handed off to lighting and effects and stuff like that. So they kind of do some quality control on that. That's more of the technical aspect. They're kind of, on top of the other stuff they do and stuff like that. It's just rechecking everything and making sure everything's up to date and keeping people posted on any changes.
Gotcha.
So we have a listener question here, and this might be a good time to bring it up. It's a question from @Dan Sorry if I said your name wrong.
I'm going to go with Dandy L.
Oh,
actually,
That's my
that
guess.
sounds way better. Thank
That
you, Rob.
makes sense. Yeah.
But what is the typical quota for layout artists, or is there a typical quota for layout artists? Because in animation it might be like 6 feet a week or whatever. But is there something like that for layout?
Kinda. It depends on the sequence. I say it's changed over the years. So back in the day, I remember it was like, if you get 1 shot a day, you're doing your job. And that slowly changed to 2 shots a day and then 3 shots. But if it's a simple sequence, where it's just a dialogue scene or a very kind of tender moment where it's more of the acting of the characters and not so much the movement of the camera, you could go anywhere between 2 to 5 shots depending on how fast they are. But I would say on average maybe I say 2 to 3 shots a day would be safe. If it's a big action sequence and stuff like that, and there's some complicated moves, maybe less than that. There's some shots where it's a long shot, and I know in Raya and the Last Dragon there was the big shot at the end where the characters were saving the village, and one camera is going from one character to another character. And it's like, a 2-minute long shot. Yeah. So that one, that one shot could take, anywhere between a few days to a week to, block out correctly because it's a very complicated thing. So it depends on what the shot is. But that's probably what the shot and the sequence and the difficulty. So the average numbers could vary.
Yeah, and quota is a weird word to use in terms of layout, because we have many passes at the entire sequence, and while we're working on that whole sequence, generally as a solid chunk, we're also having many check-ins in between, at which point more shots may be created or shots taken away.
Oh, that makes sense.
So, so I think reducing it to a shot count on an average that's probably pretty accurate. But the truth is it's malleable and and it's dealt with as a sequence. But we have what we call workbook, which is our first review, and that's really rough staging, and it's very much it's almost more of a check to see if the world is going to work for the sequence that has to take place. We do get cameras in there that mean something, They mean things, and the characters in places that mean things. We're starting to make lens choices. All these things that we do are being done. But the big test is you, the directors, have never seen this world. You've never seen the sequence in this world. Is this kind of what you were thinking? Like, is this a good interpretation of the storyboards, or at least of the moments you expect to be there? As fast as we can do it, as fast as we can turn it around. And that's before it goes back into editorial to ever start to be recut. So it's kind of like a safety check. I often call it the, is this thing on kind of review.
Man, that brings up a really good point, because the sequence that we get from the storyboards or editorial is never the same length as the sequence that we export out. So because when it comes out from our departments, I'm sure in animation and effects and stuff, they know the exact shot and the exact length that needs to be. And maybe they might need to add frames or something here and there, but you at least know what the shots and how many shots are going to be there. But in our case, there'll be, depending on the artist or maybe editorial, go, hey, you know what? We need a close up of the hand, or we need a close up of the foot to tell this story point. And a lot of times the artist will say, okay, it was 2 shots. Now it's 5 shots because I had to tell the story and had to do some inserts and do this to get that point across. And sometimes you have 3 shots, and we combined all 3 shots into 1 shot. Because we didn't need to jump around so much because you could tell it with 1 shot. So a lot of that process goes in. So again, someone who might had 5 shots on their plate, now they have 10 shots on their plate. Someone who's got 6 shots, maybe now they only have 4 shots because they were able to combine it. So that's part of that's why it's really hard to nail the exact number, because it's part of the process as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And we could have 10 shots that are all same as's. And for us, it's doing it once.
Gotcha.
Copy and paste. That might be simplifying a bit, but it's not, it's not necessarily that different from that if it's all the same shot. It's not like we're animating each frame. We're setting up the camera and the characters. And if they're not moving, that relationship stands for however many times we use that particular setup. So it's another reason why shot count and quota is vague. But we've turned sequences around in maybe a matter of just a few weeks on a sequence. And we've turned them around in months, depending on complexity.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Sounds very similar, honestly, to animation, where it's like really hard to give, like, I don't know how long the shot's going to take, because it can depend on so many variables, character count, complexity. So I think you guys gave a great answer on that.
Yeah.
So that about wraps up part 1 of our day in the life of a layout artist. So stay tuned for next week's episode, where we talk about who or what types of people enjoy layout, tips on breaking into layout, helpful resources for layout artists, favorite and least favorite part of the job, and like tons more. We also have the results of our free t-shirt contest based on the reviews. So you won't want to miss it. And we all, at the Animation Happy Hour, we wish you a fantastic New Year's. Hope you've been doing well. And as always, thanks for listening. Cheers and happy animating.